Chapter 1, The Nature of Exponential Growth. People at present think that 5 sons are not too many, and each son has 5 sons also, and before the death of the grandfather there are already 25 descendants. Therefore people are more and wealth is less, they work hard and receive little. Hanftzu, ca. 500 BC. All 5 elements basic to the study reported here, population, food production, industrialization, pollution, and consumption of non-renewable natural resources, are increasing. The amount of their increase each year follows a pattern that mathematicians call exponential growth. Nearly all of mankind's current activities, from use of fertilizer to expansion of cities, can be represented by exponential growth curves, see figures 2 and 3. Since much of this book deals with the causes and implications of exponential growth curves, it is important to begin with an understanding of their general characteristics. The mathematics of exponential growth. Most people are accustomed to thinking of growth as a linear process. A quantity is growing linearly when it increases by a constant amount in a constant time period. For example, a child who becomes 1 inch taller each year is growing linearly. If a miser hides $10 each year under his mattress, his hoard of money is also increasing in a linear way. The amount of increase each year is obviously not affected by the size of the child nor the amount of money already under the mattress. A quantity exhibits exponential growth when it increases by a constant percentage of the whole in a constant time period. A colony of yeast cells in which each cell divides into 2 cells every 10 minutes is growing exponentially. For each single cell, after 10 minutes there will be 2 cells, an increase of 100%. After the next 10 minutes there will be 4 cells, then 8, then 16. If a miser takes $100 from his mattress and invests it at 7%, so that the total amount accumulated increases by 7% each year, the invested money will grow much faster than the linearly increasing stock under the mattress, see figure 4. The amount added each year to a bank account or each 10 minutes to a yeast colony is not constant. It continually increases, as the total accumulated amount increases. Such exponential growth is a common process in biological, financial, and many other systems of the world. Common as it is, exponential growth can yield surprising results that have fascinated mankind for centuries. There is an old Persian legend about a clever courtier who presented a beautiful chessboard to his king and requested that the king give him in return 1 grain of rice for the first square on the board, 2 grains for the second square, 4 grains for the third, and so forth. The king readily agreed and ordered rice to be brought from his stores. The 4th square of the chessboard required 8 grains, the 10th square took 512 grains, the 15th required 16,384, and the 21st square gave the courtier more than 1,000,000 grains of rice. By the 40th square 1,000,000 rice grains had to be brought from the storerooms. The king's entire rice supply was exhausted long before he reached the 64th square. Exponential increase is deceptive because it generates immense numbers very quickly. A French riddle for children illustrates another aspect of exponential growth, the apparent suddenness with which it approaches a fixed limit. Suppose you own a pond on which a water lily is growing. The lily plant doubles in size each day. If the lily were allowed to grow unchecked, it would completely cover the pond in 30 days, choking off the other forms of life in the water. For a long time the lily plant seems small, and so you decide not to worry about cutting it back until it covers half the pond. On what day will that be? On the 29th day, of course. You have 1 day to save your pond. We are indebted to M. Robert Lattes for telling us this riddle. It is useful to think of exponential growth in terms of doubling time, or the time it takes a growing quantity to double in size. In the case of the lily plant described above, the doubling time is 1 day. A sum of money left in a bank at 7% interest will double in 10 years. There is a simple mathematical relationship between the interest rate, or rate of growth, and the time it will take a quantity to double in size. The doubling time is approximately equal to 70 divided by the growth rate, as illustrated in Table 1. Models and exponential growth. Exponential growth is a dynamic phenomenon, which means that it involves elements that change over time. In simple systems, like the bank account or the lily pond, the cause of exponential growth and its future course are relatively easy to understand. When many different quantities are growing simultaneously in a system, however, and when all the quantities are interrelated in a complicated way, analysis of the causes of growth and of the future behavior of the system becomes very difficult indeed. Does population growth cause industrialization, or does industrialization cause population growth? Is either one singly responsible for increasing pollution, or are they both responsible? Will more food production result in more population? If any one of these elements grows slower or faster, what will happen to the growth rates of all the others? These very questions are being debated in many parts of the world today. The answers can be found through a better understanding of the entire complex system that unites all of these important elements. Over the course of the last 30 years there has evolved at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology a new method for understanding the dynamic behavior of complex systems. The method is called system dynamics. The basis of the method is the recognition that the structure of any system, the many circular, interlocking, sometimes time-delayed relationships among its components, is often just as important in determining its behavior as the individual components themselves. The world model described in this book is a system dynamics model. Dynamic modeling theory indicates that any exponentially growing quantity is somehow involved with a positive feedback loop. A positive feedback loop is sometimes called a vicious circle. An example is the familiar wage price spiral. Wages increase, which causes prices to increase, which leads to demands for higher wages, and so forth. In a positive feedback loop, a chain of cause and effect relationships closes on itself, so that increasing any one element in the loop will start a sequence of changes that will result in the originally changed element being increased even more. The positive feedback loop that accounts for exponential increase of money in a bank account can be represented like this. Suppose $100 is deposited in the account. The first year's interest is 7% of $100, or $7, which is added to the account, making the total $107. The next year's interest is 7% of $107, or $7.49, which makes a new total of $114.49. 1 year later the interest on that amount will be more than $8. The more money there is in the account, the more money will be added each year in interest. The more is added, the more there will be in the account the next year, causing even more to be added in interest. And so on. As we go around and around the loop, the accumulated money in the account grows exponentially. The rate of interest, constant at 7%, determines the gain around the loop, or the rate at which the bank account grows. We can begin our dynamic analysis of the long-term world situation by looking for the positive feedback loops underlying the exponential growth in the 5 physical quantities we have already mentioned. In particular, the growth rates of 2 of these elements, population and industrialization, are of interest, since the goal of many development policies is to encourage the growth of the latter relative to the former. The 2 basic positive feedback loops that account for exponential population and industrial growth are simple in principle. We will describe their basic structures in the next few pages. The many interconnections between these 2 positive feedback loops act to amplify or to diminish the action of the loops, to couple or uncouple the growth rates of population and of industry. These interconnections constitute the rest of the world model, and their description will occupy much of the rest of this book. World population growth. The exponential growth curve of world population is shown in Figure 5. In 1650 the population numbered about 0.5 billion, and it was growing at a rate of approximately 0.3% per year. 1 That corresponds to a doubling time of nearly 250 years. In 1970 the population totaled 3.6 billion and the rate of growth was 2.1% per year. The doubling time at this growth rate is 33 years. Thus, not only has the population been growing exponentially, but the rate of growth has also been growing. We might say that population growth has been super exponential. The population curve is rising even faster than it would if growth was strictly exponential. The feedback loop structure that represents the dynamic behavior of population growth is shown below. The word billion in this book will be used to mean 1,000 million, that is the European milliard. On the left is the positive feedback loop that accounts for the observed exponential growth. In a population with constant average fertility, the larger the population, the more babies will be born each year. The more babies, the larger the population will be the following year. After a delay to allow those babies to grow up and become parents, even more babies will be born, swelling the population still further. Steady growth will continue as long as average fertility remains constant. If, in addition to sons, each woman has on the average 2 female children, for example, and each of them grows up to have 2 more female children, the population will double each generation. The growth rate will depend on both the average fertility and the length of the delay between generations. Fertility is not necessarily constant, of course, and in Chapter 3 we will discuss some of the factors that cause it to vary. There is another feedback loop governing population growth, shown on the right side of the diagram above. It is a negative feedback loop. Whereas positive feedback loops generate runaway growth, negative feedback loops tend to regulate growth and to hold a system in some stable state. They behave much as a thermostat does in controlling the temperature of a room. If the temperature falls, the thermostat activates the heating system, which causes the temperature to rise again. When the temperature reaches its limit, the thermostat cuts off the heating system, and the temperature begins to fall again. In a negative feedback loop, a change in one element is propagated around the circle until it comes back to change that element in a direction opposite to the initial change. The negative feedback loop controlling population is based upon average mortality, a reflection of the general health of the population. The number of deaths each year is equal to the total population times the average mortality, which we might think of as the average probability of death at any age. An increase in the size of a population with constant average mortality will result in more deaths per year. More deaths will leave fewer people in the population, and so there will be fewer deaths the next year. If on the average 5% of the population dies each year, there will be 500 deaths in a population of 10,000 in 1 year. Assuming no births for the moment, that would leave 9,500 people the next year. If the probability of death is still 5%, there will be only 475 deaths in this smaller population, leaving 9,025 people. The next year there will be only 452 deaths. Again, there is a delay in this feedback loop because the mortality rate is a function of the average age of the population. Also, of course, mortality even at a given age is not necessarily constant. If there were no deaths in a population, it would grow exponentially by the positive feedback loop of births, as shown below. If there were no births, the population would decline to 0 because of the negative feedback loop of deaths, also as shown below. Since every real population experiences both births and deaths, as well as varying fertility and mortality, the dynamic behavior of populations governed by these two interlocking feedback loops can become fairly complicated. What has caused the recent super-exponential rise in world population? Before the Industrial Revolution, both fertility and mortality were comparatively high and irregular. The birth rate generally exceeded the death rate only slightly, and population grew exponentially, but at a very slow and uneven rate. In 1650 the average lifetime of most populations in the world was only about 30 years. Since then, mankind has developed many practices that have had profound effects on the population growth system, especially on mortality rates. With the spread of modern medicine, public health techniques, and new methods of growing and distributing foods, death rates have fallen around the world. World average life expectancy is currently about 53 years and still rising. On a world average, the gain around the positive feedback loop, fertility, has decreased only slightly, while the gain around the negative feedback loop, mortality, is decreasing. The result is an increasing dominance of the positive feedback loop and the sharp exponential rise in population pictured in Figure 5. What about the population of the future? How might we extend the population curve of Figure 5 into the 21st century? We will have more to say about this in chapters 3 and 4. For the moment, we can safely conclude that because of the delays in the controlling feedback loops, especially the positive loop of births, there is no possibility of leveling off the population growth curve before the year 2000, even with the most optimistic assumption of decreasing fertility. Most of the prospective parents of the year 2000 have already been born. Unless there is a sharp rise in mortality, which mankind will certainly strive mightily to avoid, we can look forward to a world population of around 7 billion persons in 30 more years. And if we continue to succeed in lowering mortality with no better success in lowering fertility than we have accomplished in the past, in 60 years there will be 4 people in the world for every 1 person living today. World economic growth. A second quantity that has been increasing in the world even faster than human population is industrial output. Figure 6 shows the expansion of world industrial production since 1930, with 1963 production as the base of reference. The average growth rate from 1963 to 1968 was 7% per year, or 5% per year on a per capita basis. What is the positive feedback loop that accounts for exponential growth of industrial output? The dynamic structure, diagrammed below, is actually very similar to the one we have already described for the population system. With a given amount of industrial capital, factories, trucks, tools, machines, etc., a certain amount of manufactured output each year is possible. The output actually produced is also dependent on labor, raw materials, and other inputs. For the moment we will assume that these other inputs are sufficient, so that capital is the limiting factor in production. The world model does include these other inputs. Much of each year's output is consumable goods, such as textiles, automobiles, and houses, that leave the industrial system. But some fraction of the production is more capital, looms, steel mills, lathes, which is an investment to increase the capital stock. Here we have another positive feedback loop. More capital creates more output, some variable fraction of the output is investment, and more investment means more capital. The new, larger capital stock generates even more output, and so on. There are also delays in this feedback loop, since the production of a major piece of industrial capital, such as an electrical generating plant or a refinery, can take several years. Capital stock is not permanent. As capital wears out or becomes obsolete, it is discarded. To model this situation, we must introduce into the capital system a negative feedback loop accounting for capital depreciation. The more capital there is, the more wears out on the average each year, and the more that wears out, the less there will be the next year. This negative feedback loop is exactly analogous to the death rate loop in the population system. As in the population system, the positive loop is strongly dominant in the world today, and the world's industrial capital stock is growing exponentially. Since industrial output is growing at 7% per year and population only at 2% per year, it might appear that dominant positive feedback loops are a cause for rejoicing. Simple extrapolation of those growth rates would suggest that the material standard of living of the world's people will double within the next 14 years. Such a conclusion, however, often includes the implicit assumption that the world's growing industrial output is evenly distributed among the world's citizens. The fallacy of this assumption can be appreciated when the per capita economic growth rates of some individual nations are examined. See Figure 7. Most of the world's industrial growth plotted in Figure 6 is actually taking place in the already industrialized countries, where the rate of population growth is comparatively low. The most revealing possible illustration of that fact is a simple table listing the economic and population growth rates of the 10 most populous nations of the world, where 64% of the world's population currently lives. Table 2 makes very clear the basis for the saying, "The rich get richer and the poor get children." It is unlikely that the rates of growth listed in Table 2 will continue unchanged even until the end of this century. Many factors will change in the next 30 years. The end of civil disturbance in Nigeria, for example, will probably increase the economic growth rate there, while the onset of civil disturbance and then war in Pakistan has already interfered with economic growth there. Let us recognize, however, that the growth rates listed above are the products of a complicated social and economic system that is essentially stable and that is likely to change slowly rather than quickly, except in cases of severe social disruption. It is a simple matter of arithmetic to calculate extrapolated values for gross national product, GNP, per capita from now until the year 2000 on the assumption that relative growth rates of population and GNP will remain roughly the same in these 10 countries. The result of such a calculation appears in Table 3. The values shown will almost certainly not actually be realized. They are not predictions. The values merely indicate the general direction our system, as it is currently structured, is taking us. They demonstrate that the process of economic growth, as it is occurring today, is inexorably widening the absolute gap between the rich and the poor nations of the world. Most people intuitively and correctly reject extrapolations like those shown in Table 3, because the results appear ridiculous. It must be recognized, however, that in rejecting extrapolated values, one is also rejecting the assumption that there will be no change in the system. If the extrapolations in Table 3 do not actually come to pass, it will be because the balance between the positive and negative feedback loops determining the growth rates of population and capital in each nation has been altered. Fertility, mortality, the capital investment rate, the capital depreciation rate, any or all may change. In postulating any different outcome from the one shown in Table 3, one must specify which of these factors is likely to change, by how much, and when. These are exactly the questions we are addressing with our model, not on a national basis, but on an aggregated global one. To speculate with any degree of realism on future growth rates of population and industrial capital, we must know something more about the other factors in the world that interact with the population capital system. We shall begin by asking a very basic set of questions. Can the growth rates of population and capital presented in Table 3 be physically sustained in the world? How many people can be provided for on this earth, at what level of wealth, and for how long? To answer these questions, we must look in detail at those systems in the world which provide the physical support for population and economic growth.